much for joining us, Kelvin and Thomas. Let me start with sort of explaining how the idea of this session came about. So I think it was around this time last year when I heard Kelvin from A-Star giving a talk about the Singapore food story. In fact, I think it's the first time that like all three of us were like together at the same place, right? So like two of you met there as well in the Yale MUS event. Anyway, I was like really blown away by Kelvin's speech and also how progressive the Singapore government's policy is with regard to all protein. I mean, Singapore is in a very unique position, importing 90% of its food. It has no baggage whatsoever of an existing animal agriculture industry and workforce. So I think in Asia, probably only Hong Kong is in the same position like Singapore, right? Like importing most of our food, not much of an existing agriculture industry, being a financial hub, having an affluent consumer market. So that is like one end of the spectrum. And then on the other hand of the spectrum, we have countries like Australia, which has so many vested interests in traditional animal agriculture, both domestically and exporting to other countries. So that's where Thomas comes in. Thomas, CEO of Food Frontier, who's been building and accelerating the alt protein ecosystem in Australia and New Zealand. I've been a huge fan of your work. All the reports that you've produced over the past few years were just so spot on, strategically nailing a gap in the industry, and so well done. And Thomas just launched another great report last week, super exciting, and we're going to talk about that too. So today we're going to discuss, like, from a policy perspective, how our countries and policymakers or regulators in countries under such extremely different circumstances, or how are they looking at alternative protein differently? How can we grow the alt protein sector under these circumstances, and how would the strategy be different? So that's kind of the premise of today's session. So first, let's talk about the economy, in particular the jobs, because most of the naysayers, you know, this is like, for them, this is like the first go-to argument, right? Like, and from a policy angle, is a very important factor to consider. So I'm going to share my screen right now because Thomas has done a report right on point. So let me start with asking Thomas, like this. So you guys are seeing the screen okay now, are you? Yeah. Yeah. So you created this report which basically forecasts the economic opportunities, including new jobs that can be created from the alt protein sector. Can you tell us more about that?
Absolutely. So we released this piece of work almost a year ago now. It's available from our website for download for anyone who wants to check it out. And look, it was important for us as an organization that's trying to bring to attention the opportunities that alternative proteins present, and operating in a country like Australia or a country like New Zealand, where our food and agriculture sectors are so prominent and employ a lot of people, and we export an enormous amount of food into the Asia Pacific and other parts of the world, that we be able to illustrate that opportunity with the data and the research to back it up. And so we determined that there wasn't information of that nature available, both about the size of the plant-based meat market today, as well as projections for what it could be in 10 years. And so we commissioned Deloitte Access Economics to undertake that research. And for the 2030 scenarios, they laid out 3 different possible growth pathways. And for the moderate growth scenario, they determined that it could easily be a $3 billion consumer sector for Australia, and that we could have considerable exports of these new protein products. And so that piece of work, I mean, when we launched it, it generated headlines nationally and even internationally in a few instances, and helped to reframe that conversation from, rather than there being questions raised and points made about it being a threat or a problem, to actually know this is an opportunity, this is a value-adding sector, this is an and not an or, it can actually add to Australia's food and ag industry. And we've since used it for all sorts of engagements with policymakers, with the agricultural sector, It's been used in ministerial briefings. It's still being used by the media to illustrate the size and value of the market. Even up until the last month, there were a few more articles. And even by the agriculture sector themselves. So the Australian Farm Institute released their own report in Q1 of this year to answer whether alternative proteins are a good or a bad thing for Australian agriculture. And not only did the report state that this industry can be value-adding and a positive addition, it referenced Food Frontier, I think, 10 or 11 times and drew upon this economic data as well as our consumer research that we did last year to make that point. And so in a lot of instances, it's about us trying to equip those leaders and representatives to have more informed conversations with their industries and their constituents, because understandably, you've got farmers here who are fearful of what this space could mean for them. And so by us actually equipping their representatives with the right data to have more informed conversations, we can move that conversation along. And I'll just finish on one final point, which is that yesterday we actually announced a really exciting and first of its kind partnership with the agriculture sector, which was with the National Farmers Federation, our chief agricultural lobby group, and the New South Wales Farmers Group, which is on the future of protein. So a forum that allows for more of that kind of dialogue. So the conversation has come very far from where we were even 12 or 18 months ago to being far more constructive. And now it's about looking at, that 2030 scenario that Deloitte laid out would mean 6,000 additional jobs for Australia across that supply chain. And so now it's about having conversations with state governments about what that actually looks like and how we realize that opportunity.
That is super amazing. Congratulations, by the way. That's like a huge, huge milestone, right? Like, this is really just everybody really working on this together, side by side. There's no, you against me, and that's where it needs to go in order to scale this up, in order for all protein to be mainstream. It is, we were just talking about this with Yuki, like the session before, like leaving no one behind, right? You gotta have to think ahead. How to integrate this into the existing system. I just want to let the audience know that you can double click on the screen that I'm sharing, like with the data from Thomas's report. Double click on it and you can maximize the screen so that you can actually see the numbers. So if I can dive a tiny bit, more into those numbers, because I think it's like so amazing to first of all have this idea to kind of have this forecast to project, where this is going, like what positive impact to the economy, to creating jobs, like what this can bring. Can you tell us a little bit more about like how you're framing this? So you have 3 different scenarios. So like not being super aggressive as to, this is going to take over, right? Like how did you kind of frame these 3 different scenarios, and where do you see actually we will be getting to, specific scenarios in how many years?
Yeah, so everything we do, we try and be as evidence-based and data-driven as possible. And of course, when making any predictions about what the future looks like, you have to consider a whole range of different scenarios, and no one has a crystal ball. But with this piece of work that we did with Deloitte, we tried to be as precise as we could be. And so there was a lot of different data that went into this modelling in terms of how the sector has grown in similar markets overseas, how we've seen sectors grow historically with similar sorts of factors and drivers, comparing it to other food sectors in Australia, looking at export potential, et cetera, et cetera. And so the 3 scenarios are basically Deloitte saying, well, if there was this amount of uptake and this amount of investment and this amount of R&D, it could be scenario 1 versus increased investment, R&D and consumer interest, scenario 2. And then scenario 3 is sort of more in that Eat Lancet Commission recommendation type world. If people were to really significantly reduce their consumption of meat in alignment with those global recommendations, and what that would mean for plant proteins and alternative proteins. And so, yeah, by actually putting some figures around it, it lets us have far more informed conversations. And it also, it equips, even governments with data they can then use to inform policy decisions and investment decisions. And in the context of agriculture, that's about producing the primary inputs for these products. I mean, Australia grows hundreds of thousands of tons of legumes each year, but it's not value added. It just goes out into the global commodity market in most instances. And so we need to invest in the plant protein fractionation facilities to be able to actually turn that product into a product, an ingredient that's going to be of more value, that's going to allow farmers to profit from this industry and allow manufacturers to source Australian grown proteins.
That's really awesome. I'm gonna turn to ask Kelvin. So the other extreme of the spectrum, right? How is the Singapore government thinking about our protein and job creation? And especially, please touch on your amazing point about horizontal mobility across industry verticals that I love so much. You're gonna have to talk about that.
Sure. I think what I hope that we achieve such value addedness here in Singapore as well. I think part of what Thomas has presented, value added, has to do with the kind of the quality of jobs that we create in Singapore. Now in Singapore, as you mentioned, we don't have a lot of primary agricultural activity in Singapore. We have only about 100-ish fisheries and farms. We don't produce cattle meat, more milk maybe. And on seafood, we have a lot more, and that's because we are a very coastal country. So when it comes to bringing in alternative proteins, proteins that can mimic or replace potentially our consumption of chicken, consumption of beef and pork, we are basically creating a whole new industry here in Singapore. But when we look deeper into alternative proteins, we look at insect protein, we look at cultured meat or cultivated meat, or plant-based meat or microbial protein. These require skill set that traditionally may not come from the farmer. So we are trying to see, like for example, especially in microbial protein and cultured meat, we are taking traditionally farmer-style biotech kind of skill set, and we are bringing them into the food sector. So what happens is there will be some interaction between the farmer sector and the food sectors. This means that the workforce can actually have more jobs to choose from. They can actually try different. They can apply their skills in more than one company, and they can also start to move between industry verticals. So when we see workforce moving between industry verticals, I call it horizontal mobility. It's something that I made it up. It's not like I don't think it's. So what happens is the job market could become more dynamic, and it means that people have more options and stuff like that. So when the job market becomes more competitive, hopefully we get better jobs as well as the different companies compete for the same talent. We already see this currently in Singapore, right? We have Show Meats, we have Turtle Tree Labs, we have couple of other companies here in Singapore, and they really request for talent in bioprocessing, molecular biologists, cell biologists who traditionally are not trained in the food scene. So can Singapore do this? And Singapore is not new to upskilling and reskilling our workforce. We do have ministries with agencies called Workforce Singapore or Skills Future Singapore, and we have been trying to reskill and upskill our workforce all the time. Because Singapore as a small country, we have to move fairly quickly to keep our jobs competitive, to keep our companies competitive. So these opportunities for skilling and reskilling, we already have schemes set up. We just have to keep repurposing them for different industries as we move in more and more. So if you're a Singaporean in Singapore and you have tried different industries and they're really good at tapping on our Workforce Singapore and our Skills Future Singapore schemes, what would happen is you'll be amassing a lot of skills and experiences in your own life, and hopefully at one point you would start your company on yourself, right, on your own, and then become an entrepreneur and bring Singapore to new heights.
Yeah, and I think that is like so now, right? In terms of the workforce is planning what it means by like what work means has been changing drastically, and I think definitely with COVID, like remote working as well, the workplace is gonna be changing so much. What it means by having a job or being a slack, as I like to call myself.
No, you're not.
From I am a Slack. I'm now Slack entertainer. Actually, I'm adding that to my title. Yeah, like people are not gonna, like, the world is changing so fast. People are not gonna be staying in the same job their whole life, not even staying in the same industry their whole life, right? And to be able to have that mobility across industry verticals, I think is gonna really create opportunities for companies, you know, people building their careers and really moving talents across that way. It's just gonna accelerate, you know, from a policy standpoint, the growth of a country. So I mean that's like so now. So talking about competition, I want to kind of talk about something that I observed. You know, let me know if you think this is true or not. Especially when it comes to cultivated meat, because regulation seems to be such a barrier, right? But my personal bet, I've said many times, is that it's going to happen first in Asia. Either Singapore or Japan will have the first cultivated meat product approved, go to market soonish, wink, wink. So I actually see these startups, you know, from Israel, from Europe, literally like what I would call shopping for regulators, you know, going on these tours around different Asian countries, basically finding who is the regulator that's easier to work with, that is like most progressively thinking about this, so that they can have a place, like a target market, to launch their product with a very clear timeline. So Thomas, you also kind of talk about, you know, when advocating for this industry, talking to government, there is that sense of urgency created by this competition, you know, across different countries, and that if you don't act now, then, you know, you kind of lose out and you don't stay competitive in the global market. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, for a country like Australia or a country like New Zealand, there's considerable risk in being complacent when it comes to the future of food and agriculture. And sure, we can have a sense that there's significant demand for our product, and there always will be, but you know, no one has a crystal ball, as I said earlier. No one knows exactly what the protein market will look like globally in the future. But what we do know is that alternative proteins will have to play a considerable role in feeding populations, and will therefore make up, you know, represent a significant portion of that pie, potentially the majority, you know, within a number. And so the question isn't, do we want to be part of it? The question is, can we afford not to be? And I guess that is sort of the message that we're trying to promote here, is that it's about future-proofing. It's about diversifying. It's about, you know, not putting all your eggs in one basket, pun intended, because we don't know what the future holds. We also know there's greater uncertainty now than ever. I mean, looking at the pandemic as one example of that, and the impact that's had on supply chains, and the questions that's raised about the reliability and risk of, you know, industrial animal agriculture as a means to feed populations. So there are certainly a lot of imperatives for that diversification. And our message for a food producing nation like Australia or New Zealand is that this can be an and, not an or. I mean, we will continue to export our product. We export about 70 to 80% of the meat that we produce. But it doesn't mean that we can't increase those outputs with new protein sources as well, certainly in the next decade or two.
I like it. Can I talk about the diversification point?
Yes, please.
Yeah. I think diversification is so important for us in Singapore. I think this morning I was looking at some numbers. In 2004, Singapore was importing from only 140 countries, but by 2014, in the 2010s, late 2020s, we are importing from 180 countries. And the last I checked, we only have 195 countries in the world. So I don't know how many more countries we can go to. But in terms of importing 90% of our food, if we can't import from more countries, we can only import more from each country. So what happens is when you bring in technologies like cultured meat, like microbial protein, like insect protein, you are importing different kinds of supplies from each country. And if we widen that kind of supply routes to convert especially non-food to food type of materials, which is different than the plant-based kind of story, then indeed we have diversified our trade routes, our supply chains from each country. Then for Singapore, we get a larger security because if some sort of supply chains get disrupted, whether due to COVID or other kinds of tensions between countries, we still have a way to feed our Singaporeans.
Yeah, I think food security, like for a long time for Singapore, we talk about food security a lot, like the 30 by 30 policy push, because like Singapore, as I just wrote in the chat box, imports 90% of the food it consumes. And with the pandemic, it seems like not only Singapore, all the countries are kind of waking up to this food security issue that all of us face and the vulnerability in the supply chain. Sorry, Thomas, I cut you off there. What did you want to say?
Oh, no, I was just going to build on what Kelvin said in that, the leadership that's been demonstrated by Singapore in this area is really fantastic and helps players like us to have the conversations we're trying to have with our government by being able to point to Singapore as a key example of a market that is actually putting its money where its mouth is with regards to alternative proteins. And, back to that sort of complacency point, I when I was in Singapore last year, walked into a supermarket. I mean, it was in, central sort of affluent area, but noticed that a significant portion of the beef and the pork that was on shelves was Australian. And so what does it mean for a nation like Australia that relies on exporting these products if markets like Singapore are investing considerably in starting to produce, their own food using new methods? And I have no doubt that, Singapore will deliver on its targets around the 30 by 30 initiative. And so, again, it goes down to that piece around diversification being so important to future-proofing these industries.
And the positioning of different countries can be very different, right? So Thomas, like Australia, I mean, huge land, resources, etc. Food production in Australia is very different from food production in Singapore. Like, for instance, Singapore is never really going to position itself as a manufacturing hub, right? So what is the game plan here for Singapore?
For Singapore? Well, definitely intellectual property is very important to us. For Singapore to remain competitive, we have to keep innovating. To keep on innovating, we need to be able to lock down certain IP here in Singapore, which is why when we launched R&D programs like the Singapore Food Story R&D program, 144 million Singapore dollars, what happens is we are funding public performers as well as potentially some private research performers, and then the IP that's locked in Singapore. So once we have that IP, we can actually have businesses resulting from this IP, and we can anchor some jobs here in Singapore and some revenue coming into Singapore, and yet still have these businesses use this technology overseas to, you get worldwide patents and stuff like that. But because we have some ownership here, we have some control over how these businesses, benefit Singapore. But the important thing here is that when we help companies internationalize, right? Singapore only has like 5.6 million people. They need help, right? We cannot expect everyone to be a technopreneur. And that's why we have agencies like the Economic Development Board, agencies like Enterprise Singapore. It really helps us maintain pulse on the markets and our ability to innovate here in Singapore and overseas. Now, the ability to achieve economic viability for any business, especially agri-food business, is key for us to secure food security and secure food resilience in Singapore. If these companies don't thrive in the private sector, they won't be able to produce food for Singapore sustainably. So therefore, understanding the consumer perceptions, and that's a lot of knowledge needed. We work with our social scientists in the NTU, Nanyang Technology University, and A-Star, we have some as well. Understanding consumer perceptions, not just locally, but also regionally and internationally, it's important to guide not just our R&D, but also our business strategies. This is the only way for us to make sure that we have a holistic innovation strategy moving forward, not just at the ecosystem level, but also at the company firm level.
Yeah, I love this. heard many people talk about this before, like Singapore government runs like a company, and like I think this is really where it thrives, right? Like thinking that the business needs to be successful because we actually touched on government funding quite a few times in different panels in this summit. The fact that for alt protein to go mainstream and to really accelerate and scale up, just like any other sort of like the traditional agriculture industry, which is heavily subsidized by many governments, and the R&D that kind of created what we have now as the conventional agricultural industry, was really a lot of it funded by the government. So Kelvin, you just mentioned, because of this 30 by 30 policy push, the Singapore government is putting a lot of funding into R&D to kind of support that. I'm wondering, Thomas, sort of how do you see that we can sort of move government funding not just towards alternative protein, and how important it is that it happens for the sector?
Yeah, I mean, alternative proteins, will alternative proteins grow without government supporting it? Yes. Can it grow considerably faster, and can markets, certain nations benefit far greater from these industries if they do come to the table and actually put dollars down and set themselves up to be attractive places for alternative protein pioneers to do business? Absolutely. And so I guess that's the question that different countries need to ask themselves. And I think, markets like Singapore have done such a great job and are doing such a great job of setting themselves up as attractive places for companies and scientists in this space to operate. And linking back to your original point with this question, Elaine, around regulation, if there's a country that has multiple cellular ag ventures up and running and developing product and trying to raise capital, and that market isn't making any progress on regulation to create a pathway for those products to be able to be brought to market, of course they're going to go offshore and do shop around for regulators, as you put it, Elaine, because they're not going to have the investor trust in terms of establishing and building out in that particular market, and they're not going to be able to fulfill their potential as a company. And so there's risk in countries, not governments not coming to the table on this and making enough progress, and being able to acknowledge that this is a industry worth investing in because we know it's an industry of the future.
For government to, as you said just now, Thomas, like government can support by creating the regulatory framework to create a path to market. Government can also support, as Kelvin said, to put in funding, R&D, policy push, etc. I want to move on to talk a little bit about social impact. So we've been talking a lot about looking at this as what can it do for the economy, right? Job creation, etc. Being competitive in the international scene. Social impact that's not directly reflected in GDP, for instance, public health, nutrition. This is obviously very important for policymakers as well. And I want to ask Thomas this question first, because you just released a report last week. I'm going to pull it up on screen now. Congrats again. So it's plant-based meat, a healthier choice, ? So that kind of looks into the nutrition value of plant-based meat, comparing these products with conventional meat products, and kind of debunking many misconceptions about whether this is a healthier choice. Can you tell us more about how you approach this issue and why, and what are maybe some of the most, the biggest and maybe surprising findings from this report?
Sure. So this was by far the most extensive and precise research report that we've produced to date. And the intention behind it was, we had acknowledged, as this category has received more attention, more products have hit supermarket shelves and restaurant menus, there are more questions being asked naturally by both consumers and also healthcare professionals about whether these products are healthy. Firstly, we wanted to reframe that question rather than being a, sort of binary healthy or unhealthy. Actually ask, are they healthier? Can they be a healthier choice for people seeking to reduce their meat consumption, particularly when it comes to those meats that are of greatest concern amongst healthcare professionals and authorities, being processed meats, red meat, which we know we overconsume. So in Australia, if you look at the dietary guidelines, the average Aussie will eat double the amount of red meat annually than is recommended. And overall, about a third of the meat that we eat is non-lean or processed, which are the kinds that contribute to, cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes and colorectal cancer. And so we undertook this research. We looked at 95 products across Australia and New Zealand that are available, plant-based meat products, and compared them alongside their conventional meat equivalents, so sausage for sausage, burger for burger. And we looked firstly at nutrition. And you've got it up there. That might be pretty tiny for people to read, but they can see it on the website.
And get a bit of a feel of how the comparison is done.
Yeah, so we looked at 6 categories, so burgers, sausages, crumbed poultry, etc., and found that so there's a system in Australia and New Zealand called the Health Star Rating, which basically provides a simplified snapshot of the nutritional value of a product, both in terms of good and bad nutrients. 5 out of 6 plant-based meat categories outperformed their conventional meat equivalents in Health Star ratings, including some that were very significant differences.
Yeah,
and then
bacon, the conventional one only get 0.5 of Health Star rating, and the alternative protein, the plant-based option, is 3.5, right? 3.6 or something. It's quite a big.
Yeah, that's right. And so, and then in the 6th category, which was mince, it was the same. It was 4 stars for both, which makes sense because it's a product that's less processed and has less inputs. So overall, on average, we found that products are comparable or higher in protein, lower in kilojoules and sodium, which is one nutrient that's often of concern. Less fat, considerably less saturated fat, and then added benefit of fiber, which is obviously not present in conventional meat. And so on average, we found that nutritionally, plant-based meats can serve as a healthier choice. And then we have an additional chapter that looks at processing, ingredients, additives, all those other subjects that are often raised. And again, compared side by side and found that on average, there's about the same number of additives, in a conventional sausage or burger to a plant-based option. Obviously, there are certain inherent benefits for the plant-based product from a food safety standpoint, far less risk of things like salmonella. So anyway, there's a lot that the report goes into, but the intention was really to address some of that misinformation and those misconceptions that are already building as this category receives more attention, and to reframe the conversation. So we're talking about it in terms of the role that these foods can play in supporting people to make healthier choices. I mean, ideally, we would all just be eating more whole plant foods, vegetables and nuts and whole grains a lot of the time, but that hasn't worked. We've been telling people to eat more of that for decades, and in Australia, 5.1% of the population meets the recommended intake of fruit and veg. So we think these products can play a really important role in supporting people on that journey.
People are downloading the report now. I'm putting the link on the chat box again. Everybody download all the great reports from food policy on this link. Thomas, I love how you talk about you got to meet people where they are at, right? And it gets me frustrated all the time that people talk about this nutritional, whether things are healthy, as if we are all saints, eating organic food, we're all vegans, etc. That is actually not the baseline when you look at whether these alternatives are, healthy or good for you. People are actually eating pretty badly, and we're trying to move that bar up a little bit, but the benchmark shouldn't be compared with saints.
Yeah, I mean, there is what we've found through our research, and we did an analysis as part of this report of the media coverage about these products when it comes to health and nutrition, and all the commentary from dietitians and nutritionists and different voices in the space. And there certainly is this gold standard that, that dietitians, for example, will set out in terms of what people should be eating, but it's very far removed from what the average consumer today is eating. Yeah, and so we're of the belief that we really need to be taking a more pragmatic approach. I mean, there are a whole range of complex social and cultural and personal and in some cases economic factors that underpin people's choice to eat the foods they eat. And that includes meat, and meat in certain formats and certain products they know and love, and convenience and price. And we know these are at the forefront of people's decision making when it comes to food products. And so yeah, in trying to figure out how we can meet consumers where they're at, we believe that these sorts of products can play an important role in bridging that gap, and also to help solve some of the public health challenges that come further upstream in that system. Obviously, there isn't the risk of zoonosis of potential pandemics if you're producing plants as opposed to intensively farming animals, which is one of a variety of risk factors. Antimicrobial resistance. There are a whole range of different issues and considerations. So I think a holistic and pragmatic approach is needed.
Yeah.
This nutrition thing is very important. In Singapore, I think we have a professor in A-STAR. I work in A-STAR, by the way, for those who doesn't know. A-STAR stands for the Agency for Science, Technology, and Research, and we actually develop IP for ourselves or with companies. So we have a professor here called Professor J.R. Kumar Henry, and he has been one of our thought leaders in nutrition in Singapore, especially Asian diets. So when it comes to nutrition, I think trying to get a consumer to become a nutritionist is not easy. It's not going to be easy. So in Singapore, through the Health Promotion Board, we have a Health Promotion Board, and all they do is to educate people on how to eat healthily, for example. That's very important. It's a very difficult job to do, and not just eating, but also other things as well that something to do with anything to do that has to do with their health. But rather than trying to teach them all the different types of nutrients and nutrition you need to get, but they came up with this thing called the healthier choice symbol. So and on it would say on packaged products you can put on there, and it would say that healthier or lower added sugar, or lower something, or higher in calcium, higher in protein. And if you do a product to product comparison, those products with that symbol are going to be easier, to show why is this product better or healthier than another product. And whether the consumer compares that presence of that symbol with the price is up to the consumer to decide whether it's worth the additional premium to pay for a healthier choice. On top of that, it also brings us back to the alternative protein discussion. How can alternative protein bring us better public health, for example? So right now, I think if you look at just whole foods, I think in the Health Promotion Board in Singapore define a healthy plate as about eating 50% of the time fruits and vegetables, 25% of the time staples, and 25% of the time protein. Those are all whole foods. And they categorize it like this because you typically don't eat sausage every meal or tofu every meal. It is a mixture. So rather than trying to categorize nutrition in terms of individual food products, and it's hard to keep track without an app, for example, but then you would know roughly this is a high protein product, I will categorize it under protein. It's easier for the consumer to use that information on a daily basis. So with alternative proteins, what we're doing is essentially to diversify the number of ingredients we can use to make food products. And as scientists, we think about design space. When you have a larger inventory, your optimum is higher, or potentially can be higher. So when you have a larger toolbox to deal with to optimize nutritional products, right? With more, you can get a more nutritional products than you can with a smaller toolbox. So I think that's something the alternative protein space can bring to the nation when it comes to nutrition.
It's a really good point, and I think it's something I'm really interested in the context of cellular agriculture, is to see how we can increase the nutritional value and optimize products in a way that we can't with current production methods. I mean, at the moment, to produce, change the nutritional profile of a piece of meat, either you've got to feed an animal something in the hope it will absorb that, particular nutrient into its flesh, or you've got to, alter or cut off certain parts of the meat once it's a finished product to reduce fat and whatnot. Whereas, culturing meat from cells, I think, provides a whole world of opportunity in terms of what we could do.
Yes. And something that we do that I'm a consumer. I eat every day, right? But I tend to overeat. I rarely undereat. Maybe Thomas, you do because you're you look very, very, very good. But for me, it's like, I mean, I always wonder, have I overeaten, and what have I overeaten? So that's something that it's tough. I mean, and I mentioned Professor Giacomo Henry earlier on because he did a study and realized that an average Singaporean should be eating about 2,000 calories a day, but we're eating 2,600 here in Singapore. So, and then a lot of our foods we should be eating only like 25% staple, but we're eating 60% because we eat so much rice here in Singapore. So even though you can tell them, you can educate the consumers, but eventually their purchase options, their purchase decisions are still dependent on what they like to eat. And that is not just cultural, not just preferential, but also a lot to do with the taste and the price of the food product. So to all alternative protein companies out there, please do not forget about the taste, because ultimately, I don't know how much can you sell when the product is less tasty than a conventional option.
Yeah, that is such a good point, right? People don't always, actually most of the time they do not choose the healthier option. Like definitely need to be at least on par when it comes to price, taste, convenience, and then it is the added value that you're healthier, more sustainable, etc. But you just need to meet that very basic consumer requirement of the price, taste, and convenience. So that is for sure very important. We're gonna move on to Q&A now. Let me get the list of questions. See. All right, we've got. All right, I'm just gonna go through the questions from the audience. Okay, diversity would be best for the greater good, but the pandemic might push the industry towards further consolidation. How do you see the pandemic influencing the diversity of the protein industry? Interesting. Anyone want to take that one?
I'll take it. It's dangerous. So it may push us towards consolidation. It may also push towards some countries to deprivatize the food sector. So I think these are all important things for us to be aware of. Unfortunately, I don't know how much we can control that. We can only respond to it. So over in Singapore, I think I don't think that we're trying to get as many companies, our friends in Enterprise Singapore are here in A-Star and also in Economic Development Board. We try to get companies to really, beef up, unintended, the food sector and keep it private, because ultimately I guess Singapore still believes in the free market. And some sort of free market, and then when that happens, the only way we can make that happen sometimes, even with consolidation, maybe regulatory can play a role. And the link here is that even if you try to consolidate certain supply chains, the negotiating power may be higher when it comes to trying to market a product in a company, but the diversity might shrink. So then the thing is, there will still always be a gap, in the private sector on how do we fight against this consolidation, right? I think we see this in the pharmaceutical space already, right? There's a lot of new biotechs coming up because there's a lot of consolidation happening in the supplies for pharmaceutical products. The same could apply in the food. So I think as long as we are okay with challenging some of these larger trends, we will find new opportunities that are actually commercially viable.
Very well said. I don't know how much more I can add to that, other than saying that regardless of what impact this pandemic has, we know that there's going to be, a 70% increase in demand for protein globally by mid-century. And so it doesn't change that fact. And so there are going to be some nations that have the capacity to meet that demand. There are others that are going to be more limited. But to Kelvin's toolbox analogy, by investing in various different forms of protein production that meets consumer needs and can address issues in terms of resources, environmental impact, risk, public health, we actually set ourselves up better to meet that challenge.
Precisely. In small companies, there's always a mixture. There are companies whose exit strategies to be acquired, and those are the ones that are at risk for consolidation. But there are the remaining companies who are exiting by just expansion or going public, like Beyond, for example. Then these companies have, I guess, a lower risk for consolidation. So we need that dynamics. We cannot just have one kind.
True that. So in the line of toolbox, this is an interesting question. So hybrid products, as Thomas said, right? We're not seeing this as an or, it can be an and solution. One interesting is about hybrid products where animal and plant proteins are combined. What food categories, an audience was asking, what food categories would be most attractive to your country for hybrid products?
So can you say that last bit again? What food categories are most relevant?
The opportunities of doing hybrid products in what kind of food categories would that be attractive to your country? Or if hybrid would be attractive at all in your country, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? So if you go to a lot of places throughout Asia, you already get, a soup that has tofu and pork in it, right? And so the concept in some cultures of hybrid, whether it's actually, combined or whether it's just in the same dish, mightn't be so foreign. I think there's considerable potential for that category within the broader sort of alternative protein, alternative meat world to grow. We don't see many hybrid products yet across Australia and New Zealand. There's only a few brands that are available in major retailers that do it. And it's pretty old school, right? They're just adding 30% vegetables basically to a meat product.
Mm-hmm.
We've not yet seen, aside from those really cheap commercial meats that may add filler, which is one term people will use. Soy protein has been added to chicken nuggets and the like for a long time.
Is it just filler, or is it really hybrid, right? Is it like that getting hybrid, or is it just cheap filler?
Yeah. But I think there's potential to move beyond that and move beyond just, mashing in some vegetables into, some mince to make meatballs, but to actually look at how can we take the latest plant-based meat, plant protein technology, and combine it with conventional meat to create whole new offerings, which could certainly appeal to that flexitarian meat reducer sort of demographic.
I'm going to give a shout out to Jackie DeVore. I'm sure how you pronounce your name. Last name, I'm sorry. But that's exactly, hybrid products are not new. Like, if you just, I don't know, in Asian cuisine, you have your vegetable pork dumplings whatsoever. It's been around for a long time. If you take any packaged goods, you will see vegetable oil. You will see some kind of fiber, natural extracts. Where they come from? From plants. And then even though they can be used to flavored meat, so there's always hybrid products have been around for a long time. I don't think it's anything new. Even in the cultivated meat space, when you use plant-based scaffolds and mix them with meat cells to produce meat products, it's still going to be, it's already a hybrid product. I don't think you can do a fully animal one unless it's very expensive. So yeah, I think definitely hybrid products. Okay.
Yeah, a few people have made the point that for cultivated meat, there's either need or potential in the hybrid space.
Yeah, that's true. Scaffolding is plant-based, and then the cells are animal-based. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, in fact, if you make a non-hybrid cultured meat product, I'll be super impressed.
That would actually be a challenge to not hybrid.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Again, a lot of these concepts, just to kind of wrap it up, I know we're kind of going over time now, wrap it up, like a lot of these concepts, especially in the Asian culture, right? Like mock meat has been around for hundreds if not thousands of years. It's not new, but we're kind of now reimagining it. And I get these questions all the time, like how are these alternative protein products different from the mock meat that has been there for hundreds of years, that's really cheap, that doesn't taste half bad actually. And you gotta be able to explain to people like, why is this different? And for me, I think a lot of it is, firstly, it's the marketing. But the marketing also actually determines how you go about the product development, because when you're actually catering for a different consumer segment, so not the vegans and vegetarians, but meat eaters, then you would create different kind of products to satisfy that segment. So yes, I think the products themselves are different. And secondly is the tech behind it, right? So they're usually, like, there's got to be some kind of tech breakthrough, whether it then really enhance the texture, the taste, nutrition, etc. And that's how I see it being different. I think hybrid would be the same as well. It's not just like mixing something together, but like there is a reason why you're doing it in a hybrid fashion, whether it enhances the texture and taste like by many folds, like whether it is like a great nutrition like combination, etc. So I think that is sort of what we're aiming at, not just trying to repackage something old, but really trying to invent something new and like groundbreaking that would push the food frontier. It's the next food frontier. I think I wrapped that up pretty well with the food.
Yeah, that was great. Yeah, we run out of time.
Do you guys want to like, wrap this up? I've really thoroughly enjoyed this section. I hope the audience and both of you, Kelvin and Thomas as well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
It's fun.
This has been great.
I don't have to actually physically meet you to have fun now.
Yeah, we do have a lot of fun when we're together. I mean, like, I know you guys are just really good at doing this. Like, so I know that we're gonna have a really good conversation, and it's just really great for me to be able to bring the two of you together to have this conversation. I think the contrasting case study is very interesting, and to draw kind of insights from both ends of the spectrum. That's what we were trying to achieve in the beginning. So hopefully the audience, learned a lot from both of you. Everybody go download Thomas's reports. They're just great. So I've done quite a few advertisements.
Yeah, I know. Thank you. I'm gonna.
I just think lots more people should be reading those reports and learning this. So all right, thank you so much again. We're gonna take, we're gonna do a group photo. I keep forgetting. Group photo, waving goodbye to the audience.